הנוכחים. אנחנו, היום האורח שלנו מגיע מהצד השני של המסדרון, דוד קובץ' מהחוג לפילוסופיה. אנחנו כידוע מנסים גם לחבר ולראות דברים שקשורים לעבודה שלנו ברחבי הקמפוס, קודם כל אצלנו בפקולטה. דוד קובץ' הוא מרצה בכיר בחוג לפילוסופיה, הוא הצטרף אליו ב-2017. תחומי העניין המרכזיים שלו הם מטאפיזיקה, לרבות מטה-מטאפיזיקה, פילוסופיה של הנפש ואפיסטמולוגיה. הוא למד, נגיד גם דברים קצת פחות נעימים, הוא למד תואר ראשון במשפטים באוניברסיטת אצבע בבודפשט, אבל אחר כך גם דברים טובים. הוא למד גם דוקטורט בפילוסופיה בקורנל, שאותו הוא סיים ב-2000. שאחר כך הוא סיים ב-2016. הכותרת של הדוקטורט שלו זה Explanation, Dependence and Ontology, Essays in Meta-Metaphysics. הוא עכשיו בשנה האחרונה של פרויקט ISF שנקרא The Idealist Program of Metaphysical Explanation, שגם קשור, אני מעריך להרצאה של היום, וחוץ מזה יש לו קצב עבודה מעורר השתאות, ולמרות שהוא סיים דוקטורט ב-2016, הוא כבר פרסם למעלה מ-20 מאמרים, או שעומדים להופיע, כאלה שהתקבלו כבר, ובכתבי עת מהשורה הראשונה, כמו Philosophical Studies, Mind, Synthesis, Nous ו-Philosophical Quarterly. אז אני לא אקריא לכם את כל 20 הכותרות, אתם יכולים לחפש אותם ברשת, ואת כותרת ההרצאה אתם רואים לכם. בבקשה, תודה שנענית להזמנה.
תודה רבה, תודה לך הזמנה.
And the talk will be in English, no problem.
כן, רציתי להגיד את זה, שאת ההרצאה אני אתן באנגלית, אין לי הרבה ניסיון במתן הרצאות בעברית, אבל אשמח לענות על שאלות גם בעברית. שמעתי, לפחות אני אנסה. So with that, I'm going to switch to English now. So two things that I would like to begin with before I get into the substantive issues. As Shaul just said, by trade, I'm mostly a metaphysician. This is actually my first talk or paper draft that is more on philosophy of science, but it's probably going to be pre-metaphysics for the taste of many of you. This is also really work in progress, so I really welcome suggestions and feedback. It's gonna be a bit like that meme with the horse, where the back part is the beginning is a lot more well worked out than the end. So the title of this talk is What Makes an Explanation Causal? And so by way of introduction, there's this familiar distinction between causal explanations and non-causal explanations. So as Shaul mentioned, I've done most of my work over the past few years on non-causal explanation, but this time I'm going to focus more on causal explanations. So we can distinguish, I mean, there are lots of ways to divvy up the terrain here, but one distinction that we can draw is between particular and general causal explanations. So particular one would be the traffic accident happened because the truck driver lost control of the vehicle. Lots of basically all explanations of particular events fall into this category, and general causal explanations which largely revolve around causal regularities. Like lung cancer is more common in Turkey than in Sweden because a higher proportion of the population are smokers. And then there are all sorts of non-causal explanations. And again, the proviso applies here more. There are lots of ways to divvy up the terrain. This is not nowhere near an exhaustive list. It's a few examples of the sorts of explanations that are usually considered non-causal. So we have mathematical. This might be familiar to some of you from philosophy of science literature. Periodical cicada have prime numbered year life cycles because this minimizes overlap with the life cycles of their predators. There's the stuff that I've been working on over the last few years, metaphysical explanation. There's a dog in the room because there are particular, sorry, this is a typo, the particles arranged dog-wise in the room. Okay, the particles that are arranged dog-wise make it the case that there is a dog. They don't cause the existence of the dog. They make it the case in some metaphysical sense. And there are ethical explanations. Killing innocent people for no reason is wrong because it doesn't maximize utility. Very few people think that that's the reason or the only reason that killing innocent people is wrong, but it will do as a toy example. So I'm going to focus on well, in one sentence, I'm going to focus on how to even distinguish between these two categories. So how can we tell that an explanation is causal rather than non-causal? And you might find this question a little bit baffling because there's kind of an obvious answer to it. Well, causal explanations are those that involve causation, and non-causal explanations are those that don't involve causation. So we're going to see shortly that plausible as this answer might look, it's not completely satisfactory. But first, I would like to sharpen the question. So I said I want to understand how to distinguish between these two types of explanations. But already at this point, there are various different ways that you can understand this question. So there's a very ambitious understanding. And I'm going to explain what exactly the difference is among these slightly different questions. So the most ambitious formulation is what I call the ambitious question. What makes a proposition involving A and B, causal explanation of B partly in terms of A. Then there's the explanation-focused question. This is how I call them, by the way. So this is my taxonomy. Suppose A is a partial cause of B, then what makes A a partial explanation of B rather than a cause that is non-explanatory, assuming that some causes could be non-explanatory. Then there's the causation-focused question, which goes like this. Suppose A is a partial explanation of B, then what makes it the case what makes it B's explanation in terms of A, I'm sorry, it's also type of what makes B's explanation in terms of A causal rather than a non-causal explanation. So keeping it fixed that we have an explanation, why is it a causal explanation rather than some other kind of explanation? So I'm going to focus on three, and there are some reasons for this. I'm not going to focus on the ambitious question. So the ambitious question asks us to answer basically two questions at the same time. It requires some kind of a general story, a general account of explanation, and on top of it requires us to specify why within that account a certain explanation falls on the causal side. So that's why I call this the ambitious question. So this is really just to give you a taste of what it would be, what would count as an answer to the ambitious question. So just to give you an example, if the DN model were true, the deductive non-logical model, almost nobody believes it's true, but if it were true, or if I thought it was true, then that would count as an answer to the ambitious question. Or if I thought some sort of a unificationist account of explanation to court were true, and in addition to giving that answer, then I zoned in on the subset of unification explanations that are also causal. That would count as an answer to the ambitious question. Or I could be a causal theorist of explanation. I could think that every explanation is causal. That would also give you an answer to the ambition question in one fell swoop. You could basically say, well, my general theory of explanation just is my answer to the ambitious question because there aren't any explanations that are not causal. So that's really ambitious. So I'm not going to try to do that. Then there's the explanation-focused question, which basically asks, once you assuming that there's a causal connection between two events or two goings on or two states of affairs or whatever you think the causal laws are. So assuming that, in which cases is there also an explanatory connection? That question has received a lot of attention, both in the philosophy of science and in metaphysics. One view is what you could call the unselected view. So the unselected view says every cause is explanatorily relevant. Even if we have intuitions to the contrary, this is to be explained away in terms of the pragmatics of explanation giving. But every cause is explanatorily relevant. So that was David Lewis's view, for example. Why was Jimmy late from school? The entire causal history of Jimmy's being late from school is relevant. That includes even the Big Bang. There are pragmatic reasons that it's totally unhelpful to mention the Big Bang when we answer the question. And then there are all sorts of selective views. So selective views hold that not every event in the causal history of an explanandum is explanatorily relevant to that event. We can't just pack it all into the pragmatics of explanation giving. And there are various ways to give this story, various ways to provide a selective view, selective view as an answer to the explanation focused question. But I'm also not trying to address the explanation focused question. So I'm just doing this to give you a better sense of where I'm coming from to this question. I want to answer a third question. Which I call the causation focused question. Suppose A is a partial explanation of B. What makes B's explanation in terms of a causal rather than any other kind of explanation? So in the context of this question, I'm basically taking for granted some unanalyzed notion of explanation. I'm also taking for granted some unanalyzed notion of causation. And I'm just asking, when can we say that a given explanation is causal? So I'm not trying to give a general theory of explanation as in the ambitious question. I'm not trying to give a sophisticated account of causal explanation, which is what people trying to answer the explanation-based focus question are usually trying to do. I'm trying to answer this question. And yeah, this is what I mentioned. This is the reason I think this question hasn't received all that much attention until recently, because it might appear as if there is this obvious answer to it. So I'm not the only one who thinks that this obvious answer doesn't work, and I'm going to say a few words about that immediately. And finally, before I launch into the substantive discussion, just a few words about why we should even care about this question. Why do I think that this question is interesting? There are a couple of reasons. So I think it's just useful to grapple with this question because it could give us some insight into what basic types of explanation there are, some insight into a proper taxonomy of kinds of explanation. That's going to be interesting for anyone who is still interested in undertaking this project of giving a general account of explanation. It's not a super fashionable project, but some of us still haven't completely given up. I think that answering the explanation focused question could also help give us a sharper sense of the sorts of cases that a good account of causal explanation would need to accommodate. So even if you don't try to give a complete theory of explanation, just a narrower theory of causal explanation, then grappling with this question that I'm focused on should help with that. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to assume that there are some non-causal explanations. Of course, if there are no non-causal explanations, then in a way, the question I'm asking is empty. Then just trivially, any explanation is going to be causal. So the criterion of what makes an explanation is causal is this null criterion of anything. If it's an explanation, it's causal. If you don't accept this assumption, then even then, I'm hoping that the discussion follow should help you reflect a little bit more on your own theoretical commitments. So here's the I don't know why I'm calling this a paper. I haven't written the paper, it's a talk. So I'm going to start with a very simple view at the outset, and then I'm going to proceed to more, I'm going to chisel my way to more complicated possible criteria of what makes an explanation causal. And then I'm going to suggest very tentatively a criteria that I have some hope for in terms of causal proportionality. So let's start with that. So let's start with the simple view, which I think is it's an extremely natural answer to the explanation focused question. It goes as follows. If A partially explains B, then the explanation of A in terms of B is a causal explanation. If sorry, that's an F. If A is also a cause of B.
Can you specify what a partial explanation is?
So I'm assuming here that explanation is a many-one relation between explanantia, the things that do the explaining, and an explanandum. Several explanantia collectively do the explaining. You could, partly this is an account of bookkeeping. You could collect all the explanantia in one set and say that that set of sentences or propositions is the one explanans. If you have a causal explanation, for example, that appeals to some past events and laws, then or a law and some past event that is a special case, the law is going to be one exponence, and the past events are going to be further exponentia. So most of this literature that I'm tapping into is focused on partial exponentia. So that's supposed to be the basic unit. So when we try to answer the question in that way, we immediately stumble upon sort of a technical problem. So notice that I'm talking here about explanation, and then I'm talking here about causation. But the relata of causation and explanation are usually taken to be different sorts of things. So this is a very metaphysics-y kind of worry, but it worries me. The relata of causation are usually taken to be events. The relata of explanation are usually taken to be facts, or sometimes propositions, or sometimes interpreted sentences, something like that. If that's right, then this cannot literally be true. Then the same sort of thing cannot be a partial explanation and also a cause. So the various workarounds, and one thing I should note, by the way, is that this infects a lot of the views that I'm going to discuss later. So I'm not going to get back to this problem again, but I'm going to mention other proposals. The kind of they're written from a philosophy of science point of view, so they don't spend a lot of time with this problem. But when you take seriously the job of taking the metaphysics of causation into account when you think about causal explanation, then I think this is something to worry about. But there are some workarounds. So one is express both explanation and causation with a sentential connective instead of a predicate that wears on its sleeve the kind of relation or the relata of either causation or explanation. So you could say, for example, if B partly because of E, A, then B partly because A is a causal explanation if and only if A and as a result B. And this end as a result expression, that's supposed to be the ordinary, the colloquial way of using a sentential connective that expresses causal connections. Or you could try to find some kind of systematic correspondence between events and facts. So, for example, you could say that whenever an event E occurs, that corresponds to the fact that E occurs. And then the event itself could be the causal relatum, and the fact could be the explanation relatum. So there are various workarounds. I'm going to just assume that one of these works. If none of these works, then the whole question is informed. But I'm optimistic that the question is not informed. So I'm going to assume that one of these works. So what are some problems with the simple view? And what I'm going to talk about here briefly is not really new with me. So many philosophers of science think that there are scientific explanations that are best considered causal, but they don't really cite causes. So they don't fit this template that A explains B and A is also a cause of B. And yet they would like to say that they are causal explanations. So there are a few much discussed examples like this. I'm going to mention a famous case of Graham-Ehrlich. This is the case of inertial motion. It goes something like this. Suppose there's an object, it moves at a certain speed between 2 times. Suppose that no external force affects it during that interval. Why does it continue to move at the speed, with the speed with which it does between those intervals? And a plausible answer specifies some state in which the object was at time t1 or at some time before time t1, and the dynamical laws. And of course, the worry is that there doesn't seem to be any past event that causes the object to move in that direction. It's part of the whole setup that there is no external force acting on this object. So it just keeps moving in that way because that's how it was moving in the past. And there are some, it falls under certain laws that ensure that it's going to keep moving in that way. But it's not as if the past state of the object or is a cause of the event that it continues to move at that speed. So the various things you could say about this case, Brett Scow in a recent paper on the basis of this example and a few others, but I don't have time to discuss those others, but partly on the basis of this example suggests a revision of this simple causal criterion. So it goes like this, I'm quoting him, a body of fact partially causally explains E, just in case it is a body of fact about what causes, if any, E had, or if it's a body of facts about what it would have taken for some specific alternative or range of alternatives to E to have occurred instead. So the idea is the dynamical laws and this past state, these are not events that cause the body in question to move at a certain speed, but they nonetheless rule out certain alternatives. So for example, they rule out the possibility that the object would change direction or that it would slow down. It still fits this revised definition, and therefore this case of inertial motion still counts as a causal explanation, which is good because intuitively it doesn't seem like it's clearly not a metaphysical explanation, it's not a moral explanation, so it should be a causal explanation. Now there are problems with Sco's view. So one worry is that this view is it's too liberal. It classifies too many explanations as causal. So here's an example from a paper that responds to Sco by Finur Delsen. Why do I sit in front of my computer? Here's what seems to be a bad answer. Because I was drinking coffee at some earlier time. So it sounds like a totally bad answer to why I'm sitting in front of my computer. It is part of my causal history as I'm sitting in front of my computer that I was drinking coffee. But it seems to fit the bill of Sco's revised definition. It rules out various alternative histories in which I didn't drink coffee. Okay, it rules out the alternative history in which, I don't know, I was space traveling at the time at which I was drinking coffee and would not have been able to get back in time, back to my computer. But it looks like we shouldn't just on that account count this as a causal explanation of why I'm sitting in front of my computer. It doesn't even seem like an explanation at all. So, and generally speaking, Delson argues it's just way too easy to cite events that rule out at least some possible causal histories of an exponential event. Surely that doesn't make those events causal explanations of the exponential event. So we need to do better. As a result, Delson suggests a revised criteria, suggested revision to scope. It goes like this: a body of fact partially causally explains E, just in case it's a body of fact that specifies some part of the causal history of E, or it's a body of fact that specifies some part of the causal history that would have had to occur in order for some specific alternative or range of alternatives to E to have occurred instead. So compare this to the previous criterion. The previous criterion only required that the body of facts rule out some possibilities. That's extremely permissive. You know, some just any possibility. If it rules out one, it's good. This revised criterion requires that the body of facts should specify a causal history that would have had to occur in order for some specific alternative to occur. So this criterion, Delson argues, doesn't classify my coffee drinking as a cause of my sitting in front of my computer. I wouldn't have had to not drink coffee, for example, in order to do something other than sitting in front of the computer. So one question is whether this criterion still classifies this explanation of inertial motion that I mentioned 5 minutes earlier, whether it still classifies that case as causal. Arguably not. And Delson himself thinks that it doesn't. He thinks that this is an acceptable coast of the criterion. But I think that this criterion is too demanding. So the problem with Sco's criterion was it seemed to be too permissive. I think Delson's revised criterion is too demanding. So here's another example. I mean, this is kind of a well-known example from the metaphysics of causation literature. Why did the flowers die? Plausible answer, because the gardener forgot to water them. So this would be a case of absence causation. So here's one problem. The gardener's watering the flowers, that's not something that would have had to occur for some specific alternative to occur. So the specific alternative here would be that the flowers survive. But it doesn't seem like the gardener's watering the flowers would have had to occur in order for the flowers to survive. It would have, or to blossom, for example. The flowers also would have blossomed if it had just rained, or if an attentive neighbor would have paid attention and had flowered and had watered the flowers instead of the gardener. So this seems too demanding. But you can tweak Delson's criterion to take care of cases like this. So here's a suggested tweak on Delson. I promise there isn't going to be a lot of this. I promise. So bear with me. So a body of fact partially causally explains E. If it's a body of fact that specifies some part of the causal history of E, or it is a body of fact that specifies some part of the causal history that, if it had occurred, then some specific alternative or range of alternatives to E would have occurred. So it wouldn't have had to occur for those alternatives to occur. But had it occurred, some specific alternative or range of alternatives would have occurred. So I changed this necessary condition to a sufficient one. So example, if the garden hadn't watered the flowers, they would have survived, but you wouldn't have had to water the flowers in order for them to survive. But again, I'm worried that this too is too weak. Because if the neighbor had noticed that the gardener neglected his job and had been kind enough to come over to water the flowers, then the water still would, then the flowers, this is a typo, then the flowers still would have survived. But we wouldn't on that account want to say that the neighbors not having noticed that the gardener neglected his job was part of the reason that the flower died. Right? The gardener's non-watering was a cause. The neighbor's non-watering intuitively wasn't a cause. This is the metaphysician's ninja move, intuitively. So we could play various iterations on this criterion. I'm not going to try to do that. I want to get back for a moment to this simple view that we dropped at a relatively early stage. So the simple view was, if A partially explains B, then the explanation of A in terms of B is a causal explanation if A is also a cause of B. And I want to suggest something different, which isn't just variations on Skolandelsem. And I want to get to that suggestion by considering some other problems for this simple view, not just this problem from inertial explanation and the other scientific explanations that are intuitively causal but don't actually involve an event that figures in the exponendum event's causal history. So those worries had to do with the criteria not being necessary for explanations being causal. I would like to suggest that, surprisingly enough, this simple criterion also doesn't specify a sufficient condition of an explanation being causal. This is because I think there's good reason to think that not every element in an event's causal history is a causal exponence of that event. So notice this is a weaker claim than what I started with. So selectivist theorists of causal explanation think that not every cause in an event's causal history is explanatory at all. I'm making a weaker claim. Sometimes even when a cause in an event's causal history is explanatory, weirdly enough, it's not always explanatory in the causal way. Or in a slogan form, sometimes there might be something that is both a cause of an event, an explanation or an exponence of an event, but it's not a causal exponence of that event. So I want to say that this can happen. And I'm going to try to give some examples of that. So here's one case. So I'm borrowing these cases from other people, but they raised it for a somewhat different purpose. So here's one case from Alastair Wilson. This building is a church at a certain time because it was consecrated at some earlier time. Seems like this is a sort of explanation. The consecration of the church is part of the causal history of this buildings being a church at a certain time. So the consecration is a cause. It's a partial cause. It's also a partial exponence. It doesn't quite look like a causal exponence of the buildings being a church. It looks more like what I would like to call a constitutive or metaphysical exponence. Consecration is part of what makes this building a church. It's not as if building was consecrated and some causal power started doing their work, and then at some later time, finally the job was finished and the building became a church. There's constitutive connection between those events. He's a second case, A and B are married at a certain time, partly because a state-appointed official told them at a certain time, you are now married. So again, this is part of the causal explanation of, no, this is part of the explanation of A and B being married. It's part of the causal history of A and B being married, but it doesn't seem like this is a partial causal explanation of A and B's being married. The connection looks constitutive or metaphysical, and not causal explanatory. So we also,
could you a little bit elaborate why it's not looks as causal and it's looks as metaphysical?
I can't really give an argument. This is put out as intuitive. I share the intuition. It is called, so it is called, it's a partial cause, so it's part of the causal history. I don't think I can do better than just say that the way in which the official statement seems to explain why A and B are married, that seems very different from the way in which the story about how A and B met and fell in love with each other explains why they are married. I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about this. So maybe when I get into accounts of why those are different, maybe that will help. But I have to get back to that if not, that's okay. But at least Wilson and also the three authors who gave the marriage examples, so Barrow, Miller, and Tallant, they think that these are cases of temporal grounding. So basically, metaphysical explanations where there's nonetheless a temporal distance between the exponents and the explanandum. That's unusual in the case of metaphysical explanations, right? When there's a constitutive connection, you would expect this immediacy when there's no temporal gap between the exponents and the explanandum. These are supposed to be strange cases when there nonetheless is. So this is the basic idea. Barrow, Miller, and Tallant give temporal criterion of causation. So their project is a bit different from mine. They aren't interested in what makes an explanation causal. They are interested in distinguishing causation from grounding. It's closely related to distinguishing causal explanations from non-causal explanations. So I'm not going to read out this complicated definition, but I copied it here on the slides. But their basic idea is this: both grounding, unsurprisingly, and causation, more surprisingly, both can happen at a spatial distance. But in the case of causation, for there to be the relevant kind of connection, there always needs to be some temporal distance between the exponents and the explanandum. So causation always takes time, at least between spatially separate things. Causation always takes some time. Grounding doesn't have to take any time. So this is a very this is a textbook example of grounding. Socrates and the singleton set. So Socrates and the singleton set are spatially disjoint because sets are often thought to be not in space and time at all. They're spatially disjoint, but they're not temporally disjoint. It's not as if it takes time for the singleton set to start to exist after Socrates has come into existence. So even though they are spatially disconnected, so this is what they think can't happen with causation. If the spatial distance between a cause and an effect, then there has to be some kind of temporal distance. So they think that this is the intuitive core or the correct core of this dictum of no causation at a distance. So they actually think it's not quite right to say that there's no causation at a distance, but there's no causation at a spatial distance that is not also causation at a temporal distance. So this is supposed to be at least a sufficient condition for something to count as a metaphysical explanation, but not causal. But they themselves admit that it's not a necessary condition. And for this reason, it also cannot serve as a necessary condition of causal explanation. So it doesn't really legislate on the marriage and the church examples. So it doesn't. So this necessary condition doesn't say anything about whether the marriage and the church examples are metaphysical or causal explanation. Causal explanations. I find it intuitive that they are not causal explanations. I'm just kind of. I can repeat myself in a more dramatic voice because I don't really have an argument, but I find it intuitive that the sense in which the state official's formal declaration explains the marriage in a very different sense from which details about how A and B met and fell in love and how they got to know each other. The sense in which that explains why they are married. So I think that's a constitutive explanation. So here are some more puzzle cases. So these are cases these are cases of mixed explanation. So mixed explanation is one in which we chain the cause and what people usually call grounding or these constitutive connections. So we chain a cause and the case of this constitutive connection and get a sort of mixed explanation. Before I get into these examples, here's what I want to show with these cases. There are all sorts of mixed explanations, the different cases in which you can mix causes and what I call grounds and get some kind of explanation in the end. In some of those cases, it seems right to say that the resulting explanation is still a causal explanation. In other cases, it doesn't seem right to say that. And it depends on how you chain them. And the reason I'm going through these examples is that I'm hoping it can teach us something about how to distinguish causal explanations from non-causal ones. So I'm just kind of signposting why I'm going to look at these cases. But really, all I'm trying to do now is warming you up to the idea that just because an event has an explanans and that explanans is a cause, it doesn't follow that that event is a causal explanans of the event. This is what I'm trying to do with these examples. So if you don't like some, maybe hopefully you'll like some of the others. So here's a chained explanation. Suppose Jim threw the ball and the window broke. So Jim's throwing the ball causally explains why the window broke. Moreover, the fact that the window broke, partially at least metaphysically, explains why the window broke and the grass is green. If this looks puzzling to you, this is a very popular example of grounding. Conjunctions are usually thought to be grounded in their conjuncts. So this is one of those cases. So when you chain these together, you get that Jim threw the ball. The fact that Jim threw the ball partially explains why the window broke and glass is green. So this is a mixed explanation. We got it because we chained a causal and a grounding connection together. So question, is this explanation causal? My intuitive answer would be no. This doesn't seem to me like a causal explanation. It seems to me a case in which Jim's throwing the ball is part of the causal history of the conjunction. It's also an explanans of the conjunction, but it's not a causal explanans. It's not a causal explainer of the conjunction. That's what I think. I mean, why I find it intuitive. In the end, I'm going to say where I think this intuition is coming from. If you don't share the intuition, that's bad news, either for me or for you. You get to decide.
Can you go back there one slide?
Sure.
And premise B, when you say that the window broke partially metaphysically, why is this a metaphysical explanation? I don't think we can assume the window has thinkish properties.
No, it's not. It's nothing like that. I mean, the window's breaking. The window's breaking doesn't seem to cause this conjunctive fact that the window broke and the grass is green. The fact that the window broke is just part of what it takes for it to be the case that the window broke and that grass is green. It's not a, you know, when A and B happens, this conjunctive fact that A and B happens, the fact that A happens isn't the cause of this conjunction. In fact, it's just part of what it is for the conjunction to be true.
But why is it an explanation at all?
Can I just get to the end of the slides, because I'm totally going to run out of time, and I'm happy to engage with this. There isn't that much left. I'm going to get to my points.
Okay, you'll have time in the Q&A for that.
So here's another example. So notice here, the structure of the chain was A causes B, B grounds C. So you can also swap them to get a different kind of case. A grounds B, B causes C. So here's a case like that. The fact that the canvas was crimson metaphysically explains why the canvas was red. Again, this is just a very widely accepted textbook case of metaphysical explanation. Determinants are supposed to explain the determinables of which they are determinants. So crimson, if you're gonna hear it, the metaphysical intonation, you know, one way of being red is to be crimson. That's one way to be red. Part of what it is to be crimson is to be red, and some more. So crimsonness is usually thought to be a ground or metaphysical explainer of redness. Then the canvas was red causally explains why the bull attacked. So we chain them together. Then the canvas was crimson explains why the canvas was red. Again, question, is this a causal explanation why canvas was crimson explains why the canvas was red? So here there's actually a relatively standard answer. The relatively standard answer is no. And the reason it's often thought that this is not a good causal explanation is this widespread assumption that causes should be proportional to their effects. So this is a very common slogan, causes are proportional to their effects. The basic idea here is that if you explain the bull's attack by the crimsonness of the canvas, you're packing too much information into the supposed causal explainer.
I think the problem is the third line.
Yeah, there is
The canvas crimson explains why the bull attacked.
Yeah.
Third,
Yes.
third arrow. Third bullet.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Thanks. Yeah. This should be the why the bull attacked. Yeah. Thanks for. Yeah. I proofread this slide like 4 times, but you know how it goes. So the common wisdom here in the causal explanation literature is this is not a good causal explanation because it's not proportional. It doesn't matter that the canvas was crimson. Any other shade of red would have done an equally good job. The bull isn't sensitive. I'm just kind of repeating words that people very often say in these papers. The bull wasn't sensitive to whether it was crimson or any other shade of red. It's the redness that matters. So this proportionality idea is going to be important for what I'll end up saying. So in this case, I think it's intuitive that A grounds B, B causes C. In some sense, A explains C, but it's not a causal explanation. I don't think it's a non-explanation. Right? The crimsonness does some work in explaining why the bull attacked. It's not a good causal explanation. But I think you can also find examples with the exact same structure when the explanation looks, well, there does seem to be a good causal explanation. So this is my example. players x1 to x11 they score more goals than players y1 to y11. So you're talking about two soccer teams. This metaphysically explains why team 1 scored more goals than team 1. Okay, so for players 1 to 11 to score more goals, and this other bunch of 11 players, that explains why the first team scored more goals than the second team. Because that's all there is to the two teams. It's two sets of 11 players. Moreover, team 1 scoring more goals than team 2 causally explains why the umpire declared team 1 the winner. That seems plausible. We chain them together. Players x1 to x11 scoring more goals than players y1 to y11 explains why the umpire declared t1 the winner. Is this explanation causal? This seems to me causal. I mean, again, a lot of this is intuition mongering, but it seems to me a much more plausible candidate to be a causal explanation than the Bulls attack and the crimson canvas. That's my verdict, at least. So what's going on here? So I talked about proportionality. Proportionality in this the literature on causation and often structural equation models, the model causation, it's very often cited as a condition of causal relevance. I don't think it's inaccurate. I'm attracted to this old school Lewisian view, according to which any piece of an event's causal history is among that event's causes. So anything in your causal history is causally relevant to you. We don't need this proportionality criterion. Another thing people often say is that proportionality is a criterion of explanatoryness. Maximum specificity often hurts an explanation. So I also don't quite agree with that, because the people who usually say stuff like that, proportionality destroys explanatoryness, they're usually, they're always philosophers of science. Metaphysicians don't think that proportionality destroys, that maximum specificity destroys explanatoryness. Really, it's just two literatures that are largely disconnected from each other. What I think is true, and I think this is the intuition that this idea of proportionality is really capturing, it's that I think it is a plausible criterion of when an explanation counts as causal. So I think there are all sorts of explanations which are perfectly good explanations, and they don't specify the exponents as proportional to the exponandum. They would be overly specific if you wanted to give a causal explanation, but they're perfectly good as just explanations to court. So I think this proportionality idea, it's best understood as a criterion of when an explanation counts as causal. And I think we can use this to gesture at a general strategy, and I'm really just gesturing. I'm not actually trying to give a very precise view, but the general strategy would look something like this. We start with a general category of explanation, or a general notion of explanation. I never pretended to give a theory of this general notion. I'm just assuming that we have it. Within this category, in some explanations, the exponence is proportional to the exponandum, and in many others, it isn't. But in a subset of explanations, assuming a general notion of explanations, the exponents does seem proportional to the exponandum. And here's my proposal: these are the explanations that are usefully considered causal. They're going to largely overlap. They're going to largely overlap with the explanations that explain via causes, but not completely. You're going to get some of these quirky examples, like the marriage case, or the crimson case, when you have something that is an explainer. It's part of the exponendum's causal history, but it doesn't feel like a causal explainer. So my suggestion is when it's an exponence and it looks proportional, then it's going to be a causal. Then it's also going to be a causal explanation. So here's a new proposal. This is crying out to be counterexamples. So philosophers rarely dare to do such a thing in 2022 to give necessary and sufficient conditions. But this is more like an invitation for further sharpening than my last word on this. But here's a proposal. A body of X partially causally explains E, just in case there's a kind of partial explanation K of E that A provides. So there's a way in which A explains E. A is a partial causal B. It's in the causal history of E. Moreover, A is proportional to E in the sense that if there is a body of fact A star that spatiotemporally coincides with A, but is more specific than A, so it entails everything that A does, but not vice versa, then A star doesn't provide a partial explanation of the same sort that A does. So I'm actually not sure about this last part. Proportionality is rarely defined very precisely, but we are also supposed to understand what it roughly is. But that's my basic proposal. That the extra bit that you need. So in order for an explanation to be causal, one obvious thing you need is that is something that is both an exponence and a cause. I don't think that's quite sufficient. I think the extra ingredient you need is that the cause be proportional. That's what distinguishes causal explanations from explanations that are genuine explanations and appeal to causes. I thought I was done for a moment. I'm almost done. So this is a really speculative. This is just my speculation on my part. Why is it proportionality? Why this? Why not anything else? So causal explanations can be unsatisfying, I think, by invoking causal connections that just seem to be at the wrong level for a given explanatory context. So these cases are common in this. So I mentioned Woodward, for example, James Woodward, for example. So this is common in the interventionist framework. So in the interventionist framework, we try to understand causal connections by asking what kinds of interventions would make a difference to the occurrence of the effect. So in the interventionist framework, we are really interested. We're interested in proportionality because not causal explainers that are not proportional would be such that an intervention on them wouldn't necessarily make a difference. Grounding explanations are different on the other hand. The grounding explanation of a certain explanandum doesn't specify what led to that explanandum or what kinds of events led up to that explanandum. They ask what the explanandum consists in, or what it takes for the explanandum to obtain, the various locutions that can be used to convey this. We don't have this kind of pragmatic aspect that causal explanatory questions usually had. So this is really one interesting option of this, I think. And so in very recent years, some metaphysicians try to model metaphysical explanations too in an interventionist framework. And they showed that the formal aspect works just as well as with causal explanatory models. So one thing I would like to suggest is that even if you can do that, this is not very useful because the interventionist framework is much more interesting when we want to give explanations in which the exponent is proportional to the exponent. Anyway, so I can't really think of an elegant closing sentence, so I'm just going to stop.
Well, you have now your. Oh, do you want later?
Maybe it's typical of the question, and you already said that you won't answer it.
I didn't say that.
In the beginning of, because some of the explanations didn't really explain the, so maybe I'm just using like everyday terminology, and you're using terms. So what makes something an explanation?
I mean, that's a great question. I'm not. So I'm actually quite sympathetic to a unificationist view. So a unificationist view would say that explanation is a holistic matter, and it's a matter of deriving as many specific phenomena from general regularities as possible. Like, you know, systematizing the phenomena in a way that maximizes strength and simplicity and other theoretical virtues. There are lots of ways to say this more precisely, but that's the basic idea. I'm sympathetic to that. None of what I said was supposed to depend on that, though. I'm not even sure that that is really a satisfying answer, because it doesn't give you a definition of explanation. It's one of those big candidate theories of explanation on the market. But you know, to give such a theory already assumes that we have the concept. So I can't give you a definition if that's what you're asking for.
Yeah.
Conjugation.
I'm sorry, I can get.
You presented the conjugation issue of the paradox, something like that. In which Jim broke the window, so that it does not strike as intuitive, intuitive causal explanation for the conjugate sentence.
Yeah.
Given the broken end of that.
Yeah.
But so far, I'm still struggling with the problem, because it seems that had the window not been broken, you would not be able to say associate a truth value to the conjugate. If by some chance you would have a contract clause that is being triggered by this specific conjugation, it would have been triggered. And for whatever is the causes of the glass being green, you would probably say that the main issue was that Jim broke the dead window. So something there could play as a causal explanation for the conjugation.
So I want to. So if I understand you correctly, the worry is, well, it doesn't. The conjunction does seem to counterfactually depend. Does seem to counterfactually depend on the throwing of the ball. So that's suggestive of a causal explanation. So there's a lot to say about this. So one thing I would like to say is, I think counterfactual dependence is very often a great test for causal connections. But you know, there are all sorts of counterexamples to purely counterfactual accounts of causation. So the backtracking cases of counterfactual dependence when past events depend on counterfactually depend on future events. Another thing I would like to say is I don't deny that, you know, to the extent that conjunctions are the sorts of things that can be caused. And I actually think there's an interesting question about that. But to the extent that they are the sorts of things that they can be caused, I'm okay with saying that the conjunction is caused by the throwing of the ball. I just don't think it's causally explained by the throwing of
Why
the ball.
isn't it causally explained? Given that there is an explanation and that the throwing of the ball did cause the causation.
So I don't have an argument, but what I have instead of an argument is just further cases of the stream structure in which. So here's another example. Instead of a conjunction, I could have given a disjunction. So I could have given a disjunction. So instead of the window breaks and grass is green, I could have said either the window breaks or grass is pink. Either the window breaks or grass is green. So here we seem to have a causal connection. It's the throwing of the ball is still part of this fact's causal history. There still seems to be an explanatory connection. The counterfactual is not going to hold though, because it's.
Essentially, one could argue that for this counterfactual, all connection would necessitate implicitly the cause of the window being broken and the cause of the grass being green. Maybe someone painted. But there could be ways to address this junction just as well. It could be something that that calls for two causal explanations, and they need to have this specific connection. But so I'm still wondering.
I mean, the following counterfactual seems false. If the ball had not been thrown, it wouldn't be true that either the window breaks or grass is green. That counterfactual seems false. So, but I thought that your worry was that, well, the counterfactual is true. It is true in the conjunctive case. So I thought your worry was the counterfactual is true. So why shouldn't we say that there's a causal explanatory connection?
Also, this junction is
There are more people who think to.
I mean, the disjunction wouldn't be false.
is true, then your view is also true.
No, but the counterfactual, had the cause not occurred, the exponent also would not have occurred. That is false. The negation of the disjunction wouldn't be true if the negation of the putative cause hadn't been true.
Just take one case and leave it there. It seems as if even in the disjunctive case, one could argue that there is a relation between the forms of representing causal justification that derive from the structure of the conjugate system, or whatever sense.
Yeah.
Sentence that these rely on the type of.
I don't think I disagree with that. So what I tried to do was obviously very controversial. I was trying to drive a wedge between something being an explanation that appears to causes and something's being a causal explanation. I don't think that itself is a very controversial claim. So you could resist it. I'm kind of throwing these examples at you in the hope that at least one of them you're going to find intuitive, but if you don't, there isn't a whole lot more that I can do to make it intuitive.
Okay.
How about we basic question, I think? I seem to assume that there is one definitive definition of causal explanation that's stable, maybe even precedes context. And my question is this a descriptive assumption, a normative assumption? Why do you assume that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, this brings us to a very general question, but I'm actually attracted to a view which is this is what I call it explanatory idealism. The basic idea is it's kind of a contrast for explanatory realism, but the basic idea is that we start with the general notion of explanation, and we select the type of relation according to which we classify that explanation according to fairly conventional criteria. The typical way that especially metaphysicians address this question, but also a lot of philosophers of science, is that there's this robust metaphysical relation of causation in the words, and causal explanations track that. That's a very common picture. So I'm not trying to assume that the kind of picture that I like is that we have all sorts of explanations, the relatively arbitrary conventional means of classifying them according to our explanatory interests. This proportionality idea, I think, is obviously related to our explanatory interest. So Woodward, who is one of the fathers of this interventionist framework, he explicitly says that he's not trying to inform fundamental science. He's giving an account of explanation that tracks mid and high level explanatory concerns, the sorts of things that make an explanation work in practice, those sorts of things. So this proportionality intuition speaks to highly pragmatic concerns of ours. So the short answer is I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that a lot of this inquiry is guided by normative concerns. What's useful for us? I'm quite happy with that. Does it help?
Yeah, you? Yes, thanks. Thanks. It's possible that I missed something, but I wasn't quite sure why you thought it was legitimate to appeal to mixed explanations in criticizing what you call the simple view.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to me that I'm wrong, but it seemed to me that I would be open to a simple view to claim that their view was only meant to account for purely causal explanation. Maybe they wouldn't even want to think about these mixed explanations as causal, and hence as falling under what they need to account for.
So you can do that. So you can do that. Okay. But I think that at least some of these mixed explanations, they look perfectly kosher, and they also look, some of them, and they also look causal to me. So at least when it comes to those cases, it looks, you can always just lower your ambition to resist counterexamples. But in those kinds of mixed explanations, when they do look like pretty okay, genuine causal explanations, that would look like an overkill. So even if you do that, you might think that some more ambitious, broader account of causal explanations is available, which also tells you which mixed explanations are relevantly similar to the simpler kinds of explanations to which you restricted your theory. Yeah, I mean,
but it's always, it's not an attempt to lower my ambition, just kind of from a read or in order to escape your criticism, but on a more principled ground, which is that a mixed explanation just is a mixed explanation. It's not a causal explanation. It's a mixed explanation. That's a different kind of explanation, and that sort of aligns with the fact that personally, at least, some of those I didn't share.
Okay.
So the intuition, it's not that I have the opposite intuition, I just want to have an intuition. But it's not as though they obviously struck me as a causal explanation.
That's fair. One thing that worries me is at least some causal some explanations that people usually present as causal, they do have the same structure as some mixed explanations. So just to give you I looked at different types of cases, but I think the best, the kind of example that most worries me is when you explain an event in terms of an event of the form A is Fing, and F is a determinable property, and you could replace that event with some determinant of that determinable property. So, you explain something with grass is greenness, and you just replace this with grass having some determinable property. At least sometimes you can do that. So, in the bool case, it doesn't seem like you can do that. I think in some cases you can do. I'm a bit hard pressed to come up with a specific example, but another example, another type of example, realized properties and the realizers. So you explain you explain it kind of beats me to be that example very well. But the idea is you can explain something by citing some psychological property, or you could explain it by citing some neural structure that realizes that psychological property. At least sometimes both of those explanations seem okay. At least sometimes, not saying always, but sometimes both seem okay. But it's reasonable to think that the realization is one of those grounding connections. So in that case is when you cite the realizer instead of the psychological property, you give an explanation that people usually don't think of it as anything other than just a low-level causal explanation. But it actually goes through a real, it does involve some grounding connection. So if the neural structure explains some behavior, the neural structure also realizes a psychological property, and that also explains the behavior, then the causal chain does involve these grand theoretical connections. So some of the cases that I mentioned, I admit that they do feel very artificial and contrived. I use those examples because they are just they're clean, they're simple in the way metaphysicians like. But at least there are some cases when it is plausible that you have a mixed explanation that is also a causal explanation, at least in some cases.
Hey, Wood?
It's been a long day, so maybe I'm not coherent. So 1.5 questions. So the first, which may be related to what Dave was asking, but it seems, at least in how you analyze some of the cases, is that you take grounding to be explanatory, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if I want to resist that, question 1. Second question is more applied, so maybe things you haven't touched on or not interested in. But a big debate in my area is whether natural selection explanations are causal, or whether natural selection per se is causal. There are various debates and basically very strong arguments against the view that it's causal. I think it's heresy to say that it's not causal, so I'm interested. It's worrying. One thing that occurs to me from the way you analyze the situation is that one of the key moves, it's not the only move, is that there is a relation between fitness, which is what we look in the theory of natural selection, the fitness of types or something, and events that happen to individual organisms. Now, this relation is problematic because it's not really causal, right? The problem is if when you try to give it a causal explanation, we have these all kinds of temporality paradoxes, right? These things change together, right? Not one preceding the other. So I'm just wondering again and again, if you haven't thought about this, that's perfectly fine. If you want to think about it out loud, that's fine also. But whether this relation, which is at least arguably some kind of constitutive relation or something like that, may help making use of your analysis, right? Might help us escape this what seems quite strong arguments against natural selection being causal, right? Because if you assume that what causes the break is that this fitness relation does not seem like something causal, right? Then it might fall under some of these cases of grounding. Now, again, I'm just, throwing it out there. I'm not presenting a coherent argument. But I wonder if these sort of cases might make this kind of analysis, or can apply this kind of analysis.
That would be cool. I mean, so I vaguely remember these fitness explanations, but that's been a while ago. But just for me to be sure what you have in mind. So the basic idea is that you could explain, I don't know, you can explain, is this the sort of case where, you explain the decrease in the rabbit population? Can you just help me out here? Like why, so just very quickly, like why they are not?
Basically, variety, that's part of the problem, variety of issues, which is why I'm kind of wondering if there is a silver bullet, right? That reduce all these difficulties. But basically, what happens is that what actually happens, right, is what sometimes biologists call the realized fitness. How many offspring you have.
Right.
But that can't work, right? Because in a sense, the natural selection explanation is about sort of a predictive kind of fitness,
right,
which is a range of possible results.
Yeah.
These are in some sense, right, they supervene or something, right? It's a relation on the properties of the organism. Otherwise, you don't get an explanation. Now, so then it seems like you have this sort of a dilemma, which is either you say the only things doing the explanation are the specific events or properties of specific organisms, right? In which case, it doesn't look like natural selection because you have, for example, two twins that are identical, but one has bad luck, right?
Yeah, it could be just genetic drift or something.
Or something like that, right? So either you end up with this view, or you end up with sort of probabilistic analysis, which is not causal for various reasons. Right. So you're basically, well, there's an expletive here, aggregate.
I see.
Right. Yeah. So now, one of the reasons is that, or let's say, some problems. One way this manifests itself is that there are various things you expect from causality, say like the sure thing principle and stuff like that, which doesn't seem to work. When it comes to natural selection, but it seems that at least a possible thing to worry about is that natural selection as a theory talks about these things like fitnesses, and fitnesses are often we sort of think that they're caused by the properties of organisms, but that cannot be right for other reasons. It's just not a good way of explaining.
I see. Yeah, thanks. That's a great case to think about.
So we should
not. Okay. So just one thought. So I would be the last person to understand my own view. But it seems to, I mean, just based on what you said, it looks like there are also other grounds. The people who want to say that fitness explanations are not causal, it looks like they already have other grounds to say this because they already cite various exponential that in any case are not part of the causal explanation of, not part of the causal history of the exponential. One thing to say, which I think is that's a little bit confusing here. I think the language, I'm not sure what to do about this, but this stuff that I've been mostly relating to, this is like very, very abstract, a priori, general philosophy of science stuff. In that literature, the primitive notion that people are usually interested in is partial explanation. So one partial explanation, this came up already during the the talk. But that's the primitive unit that people are interested in. So from that point of view, it's perfectly possible that you have an exponandum. It has some partial exponentia. Some of them are causal and some of them are not. And it's up for grabs whether the total explanation, you would want to call it causal or not. They are going to say, well, part of it is causal and part of it is not. It seems to me that in the special science, philosophy of special sciences literature, the unit that people are usually interested in, or correct me if that's wrong, but my impression is they are total explanations or they are full explanations. So, you know, the way it seems to me is there are these fitness explanations. They cite some things that there are causes. They also cite other things, like these general fitness properties, which are not causes. And then we need to make some sort of a judgment about whether those explanations are causal or not. And I'm totally unsure what to say about it. I'm unsure what to say about it because that's just not the way I go about it. You know, because I'm thinking in terms of partial exponentia. So I'm not quite sure what to say, but that's an interesting case to think about.
And what about the first part?
What if grounding is non-explanatory?
I think this will be later because we have less than 5 minutes and at least two questions I would like to put in. So
I'm happy to get back to that. Yeah.
Leo and Ori, and then you'll answer both.
All right.
So I have a question about the general scope of the project. Because how did they talk? You go to great pains to point out and to carve out a very nuanced and detailed explanation of cases and why, if you put it this way, I'm sure your analysis is correct, and of course we cannot follow it. In some cases, I did it, some of it. But then, at some crucial places, you bring in your intuition. And an important thing for you is whether all this detailed analysis fits or does not fit your intuition. And I cannot understand that because I would think that such a detailed examination to overcome the problems in your intuition, particularly because probably your intuition and my intuition not necessarily be the same.
Mm-hmm.
So it would seem to me, for example, that your intuition is about what, in terms of Aristotelian metaphysics, is called efficient cause. And you leave aside all the other causes because you need time and all kinds of things like that. And also deterministic somehow, while, you know, in the world, in science, we know about non-deterministic causality and so on. So
Yeah.
I think the two questions that I am asking are connected, and I would like to understand how they fit into the overall view of the project.
Yeah, I'll let Ori ask, and I'll just say that I think that today we just call it the causals are only what Aristotle said efficient causes. The others are grounding and so on. And like
that's right.
Ori?
Yeah.
My question is actually a follow-up to Leo's question. Because if you think about the way that you treat the distinction between causal and non-causal explanations, as if we have, and without going into what is a cause and without going into what is an explanation, there's a kind of, the only thing that we have technically are intuitions. But when you go into a detailed scientific case, then the difference between a causal and non-causal question becomes very dependent not on some very general set of intuitions, but on the particular thing that you're worried about, say inertia. You can give all kinds of explanations to inertia in philosophy of physics. You can, if you go with Newton, you say that there's this inherent force that causes a body to move. I mean, that would be a causal explanation. Or if you say that laws of motion sort of determine how a body will move, that would be a different kind of an explanation. That is maybe causal or is maybe not. If you say that space-time structure somehow determines the inertial behavior of bodies, I mean, that's maybe causal, maybe not causal. So, I mean, it's just that it seems like relying on very, very broad metaphysical intuitions about what the difference between causal and non-causal explanation is not going to be helpful when you're going to look at a particular case that requires the details of the case. I think it's also related to the question about
Yeah, so thank you for both questions. I'm going to try to answer it. So I'm going to start, probably going to watch both. So I'm going to start with Oleg's question. So, so one question about these cases, and I don't know the ins and outs of this literature that you're tapping into. But one question I would have about those cases is, does the disagreement boil down to whether the explanation in question involves an appeal to causes to begin with? Because if that's part of what's at stake when we are arguing about whether this or that explanation is causal, then I mean to stay neutral about that. So I'm already focusing on cases when we already agreed that we are appealing to causes, and then we are going to decide the further question whether this explanation that already we agreed that it appeals to causes is causal. So there might be all sorts of interesting cases when it's already in dispute whether the best explanation appeals to causes. And I'm just my ambition is to stay neutral. Anti-ambition is to stay neutral about that question. So because I'm quickly answering two questions at the same time, it's probably both my answers are going to be unsatisfactory somewhat. But so as to Leo's question, so there's a very big question about the legitimacy and the limits of intuition-based theorizing. So I have views about this, but here's a quick case to be made for intuitions. Really, what I'm trying to do here is what it's closest to is a sort of conceptual analysis. I mean, I'm not actually giving an analysis. But that's what it's closest to. It's a sort of conceptual analysis. I'm not trying to offer some new philosophical tool that you haven't known yet, and which you can use to do all sorts of interesting theoretical work. I'm trying to give an analysis of this concept that figures in scientific explanations, but also figures in everyday thinking. And I think that intuitions are important when that's what we are trying to do, because really what I'm trying to do is to delineate the boundaries of this concept. So in that context, I think that the reliance on intuitions is highly fallible, but legitimate. I totally recognize that in many other kinds of philosophical projects, it would be far worse to rely on intuitions. But this is my very brief answer. I think if there's one kind of philosophical project when relying on intuitions is okay, I think conceptual analysis is one of them.
Okay, thank you very much for the discussion. We'll meet next week with a discussion of medicine and ethics in Switzerland.